He's called Amenhotep in this particular dynasty. The pharaohs, for the most part, took their titles to honor a particular god. And in this case, this dynasty was worshiping Amun, was kind of the primary. They had many gods, but Amun was sort of the principal god, so their pharaoh was called Amenhotep. But there was one more piece, one more qualification, if you will, is that if I'm going to be pharaoh, I basically have to be born of a pharaoh's daughter, because there was also a rule that the heir to the throne, the pharaoh, has to marry a daughter of a pharaoh. That's the way they kept the bloodlines pure. That's what they thought anyway, right? So this was the rule, which basically meant, if I'm going to be pharaoh, I'm either going to marry my sister or a half-sister, because pharaohs had several wives a lot of times, or perhaps on a rare occasion, maybe grandpa had some kids late in life, okay? He's no longer around, but there's a daughter around I can marry, right? But at the end of the day, the wife, what they call the great royal wife, had to be the daughter of Pharaoh. That's the way they're preserving the bloodlines. Well, as you might imagine, for anybody who's done any farming and raising livestock, okay, this presents a problem. It's called inbreeding, okay? And inbreeding can cause lots of problems, birth defects, and so on and so forth. But among them is infertility. And this becomes a real problem in the business of maintaining a dynasty, right, with a rule like this. You would have thought they'd known better. But this is an excerpt from some of the stuff from Ron Wyatt, which, if you recall, he did all kinds of studies on stuff before he went and started digging around and trying to look for things. But he's compiled a lot of data here, and some of it I'm sharing with you today. He says the kings of the 18th dynasty are stated by historians as being named either Amenhotep and or Thutmoses. From our research, it appears that the crown prince received his Thutmoses title upon being appointed co-regent, and then became Amenhotep in addition to his earlier names when he became emperor. And each ruler left inscriptions relating to his reign in both names. Sometimes he referred to himself as Thutmoses, while at other times Amenhotep. Each individual king left inscriptions in both names dating his regnal years, sometimes from the date of his co-regency and sometimes from the date of his emperorship. Now, if you think that might cause a little confusion, I would say, yea, verily, and amen. It causes some confusion, okay? But you have to know who you're talking about along the way. So I'm going to try to straighten some of that stuff out for you and show you some things that I'm going to submit to you. I've written in the Bible, but they're not obvious unless you understand some of this background information, right? And then suddenly, everything that's in the scriptures makes perfect sense, right? So just as a background, there's something in the name. The first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty was known as Ahmoses I. Okay, you might remember the last time, he was the guy who was credited with kicking out the Hyksos, right? But he was also the guy who first enslaved the Israelites, right? So there were like 3 or 4 pharaohs that wound up ruling during this time when the Israelites were being enslaved, right? Thutmoses means Toth bear him. Toth was one of their gods. Amenhotep honors the god Amun. Ramesses, I just throw in here, remember we've been talking about Ramesses a lot. Ramesses is a title that many, many pharaohs used because it basically says he's the son of the sun god Ra, right? So remember, I got all tripped up about science and history, assuming that if there was an Exodus, it had to be during the reign of Ramesses II, because the Bible happens to refer to him, right? But there were many pharaohs who called themselves Ramesses. Ramesses was also the name of a region. Ramesses was also the name of some cities, right? So anyway, we know that Moses means I drew him out of the water. So here's the way this succession is supposed to work, right? What they assumed was going to happen in the 18th dynasty, beginning with Ahmoses I. He marries, he has a son, and this son begins as the heir apparent, becomes the crown prince, and then Thutmoses I, and then eventually, when he's old enough, experienced enough, he becomes a co-regent with his father, and takes on the name Amenhotep I. Okay, now, these guys who are coming up through this training process are some of the highest educated people in the then known world. I mean, they had the best training for everything you can imagine. I mean, and Moses was one of them. Got all the academics, all the math, science, and engineering, all the politics, all the religion, all the finance, all of that education. They've got degrees in all that there is, and they wind up in military service. Okay, so we know that Moses was a great general. We'll talk about that here in a second as well. So Amenhotep, for this first level here, Amenhotep the first goes through the proper process. Things are working. Okay, he becomes Amenhotep the first. He marries this lady called Hatshepsut. Okay, she is in fact the daughter of Pharaoh. So Amenhotep the first and his wife are siblings. Okay, but unfortunately, Hatshepsut is childless, and she has not produced a son. So her father, Moses the first, and at that time Tutmosis the first, the co-regent who's about to become the Pharaoh sometime in the future, are getting kind of worried. We don't have anybody to succeed to the throne here, right? And Hatshepsut is under huge pressure. Reckon that she needs help with this job, but she's under huge pressure to produce a son, and she isn't producing one. So when she sees this male child in the river, she decides to adopt him as her son, and which I think is quite fantastic, because, like I say, she knows full well that the Pharaoh has directed that these children die. She knows that better than anybody, probably. All right, but back then, of course, we didn't have social media. We didn't have the internet. We didn't even have the New York Times. So the fact that this child was not her child is something that could actually be sort of hidden. I mean, the average Egyptian would not know the difference. Hatshepsut shows up one day with a little baby. Oh, look, the wife of the soon-to-be Pharaoh had a baby. Good on her, right? The only people who really know were those in the really inner circle in the palace. Her father and her husband, no. But they've sort of okayed this thing, right? Because they don't have an heir. They need an heir. So that's how. Am I doing it? Okay, we good? All right. So now the dynasty is broken. The entire succession is gone. Not only is the next Pharaoh gone, but he had no sons, so there's nobody in training after him. Oops, big problem. So what happens? Well, basically, his wife steps in as co-regent, Hatshepsut, right? At the same time, they reach down in the family tree down there somewhere, and they find somebody else and just plug him into this position of Thutmoses, okay? More than likely, the son of one of the secondary wives, right? So he's a son of Pharaoh. He's not the firstborn of a Pharaoh, okay? But he's kind of the best they got. They pick this guy and they plug him in here, but he's about 6 years old, okay? Which is a bit of a problem. So Hatshepsut serves as co-regent alongside her husband, and she starts training up this guy. Now remember, she just got done, or not done, she spent 20-some odd years training Moses. Okay, but he's gone. So she's pretty well qualified to train somebody up as co-regent. So she's serving as co-regent. She puts this guy in here, calls him Thutmoses. He's in training, right? And we find out that a couple years later, she's actually elevated to the office of Pharaoh. She is one of the very few female pharaohs in the history of Egyptian history, right? And we'll find out here in a second, she ruled for a very long time in one way or another. Okay, this is a very special lady in terms of Egyptian history, right? So we've just kind of shoved this guy in here. Notice in the second line there, Thutmoses II is missing. Why? Well, that was Moses. And he booked, and so now we've got even this naming convention we see in the history books is a little kind of off, right? I got Thutmoses III becoming Amenhotep II. What's up with that? Well, Thutmoses II went away, right? So, little piece of trivia here. These are a couple of statues of Hatshepsut, okay? You notice the one on the left, there's a pedestal there. It's got a bunch of inscriptions on it that tells a story. But it's kind of unclear. She's holding these little baby boys. And it's kind of unclear who they are. But some would suggest that the one on the left is a baby. It's probably Moses. The one on the right might be Thutmoses III, this guy that they stuck in there at age 6. But she's basically mothering and training both of them, right? But in order for her to be elevated as Pharaoh, they have to have a story, because this isn't normal, right? So they kind of make up these stories, and there's at least 3 of them out there in the historical record. One is that she had a dream, and Amun, the god, actually appeared to her and said, "You need to be Pharaoh." Okay. Some folks might believe that, but that's one of them that was recorded. The other one was that her husband, Amenhotep I, directed she be Pharaoh after he died, because he knew there was nobody else ready to take charge. This is actually a cartouche that illustrates the divine birth of Queen Hatshepsut. So they had to have some kind of a story so that she could become Pharaoh, but she did, and she became quite famous. It says, at Amenhotep I's death, his queen and sister Hatshepsut had only a young daughter, but a minor wife had borne him a boy who was apparently very young at his accession. This son, Thutmoses III, later reconquered Egypt's Asian empire and became an outstanding ruler. So this kid, this little 6-year-old kid, kind of grows up into this function of Thutmoses and really rises to the occasion. He is actually recorded as being one of the best pharaohs that Egypt ever had. Okay, so he kind of filled the shoes pretty well. It says, during his first regnal years, Thutmoses III theoretically controlled the land, but Hatshepsut governed as regent. Sometime between Thutmoses III's second and 7th regnal years, she assumed the kingship herself. According to one version of the event, the oracle Amun proclaimed her king at Karnak, where she was crowned. A more propagandistic account, preserved in texts and reliefs of her splendid mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, we'll see here in a second, ignores the reign of Thutmoses II. So here's some of the other, I'm going to call it indirect evidence of the scriptures, right? Because we find that all references to Thutmoses II in Egyptian history have been erased, or they've tried to remove them. okay? So she ignores the reign of Thutmose II and asserts that her husband proclaimed her his successor. Upon becoming king, Hatshepsut became the dominant partner in a joint rule that lasted until her death about 1458 BC. So she actually reigned with 3 different pharaohs, and we'll see in a second, you might count a 4th. So this is the temple they're talking about, big tourist attraction in Egypt, Hatshepsut's temple. It's kind of carved into the side of a mountain, but it has temples in there for her, for Thutmose III, who's this guy she just put on the throne, and this guy, Mentuhotep II, who's a later king later on. And it's in Luxor, Egypt. So let's talk about this dude that took Moses' place at age 6. What the Egyptian history inscriptions say, essentially, is that he was given credit for 22 years worth of Moses' training. Because it says he began his reign as Thutmose at year 22. Okay? So all of the exploits, all of the accomplishments, all of the history associated with Moses simply gets assigned to him at age 6. So he assumes the title of Thutmose III, about 6 or 8 years old. He reigned for 32 years after Moses left. And if you add that to his reign as Thutmose, it would have been a 54-year reign. Some of the Egyptian historical books say he reigned for 54 years. A little scientific tidbit there is that they found his mummy, and they've done the analysis on that, and they determined that he was not 50 years old when he died. Okay, so gee, how does that work? Well, they put 22 years worth of experience in there that was not his, right? So this included his time as Thutmose and co-regent and Amenhotep. Sometime during the 32 years, they think about the 3rd year, Amenhotep I died. So now we got this problem. We put this 6-year-old kid into this training program. Hatshepsut is the co-regent who's sort of helping out here, but now her husband dies. So now what do we do? She becomes in charge, is what it boils down to. He later grows up under her tutelage and becomes Amenhotep II. He had a co-regency for 29 years, so basically she didn't think he was quite ready for 29 of his 32 years. So he was formally pharaoh for about 3 years, right? She reigned with him as the co-regent. She retained her title as queen after the death of her husband. And she's in her 70s when Amenhotep II, this guy she's training, dies. Okay? And she's still a very prominent figure in Egyptian politics. She died approximately 6 years before Moses returned. So remember, how old was Moses when he left? 40 years old. How long was he away? 40 years, right? So he leaves, this 6-year-old gets stuck in his slot, okay? 32 years later, that guy dies. Okay, so now they got to find somebody else to put in there because this guy dies without a royal son as well. Okay, there is not a firstborn son of Pharaoh to put into this training pipeline. Okay, now to his credit, like I say, he became known as probably one of the greatest rulers that Egypt ever had. He finished the job that Moses and Amenhotep I started of conquering all the other nations in the area and subjugating them and drawing tribute and all that kind of stuff. He truly completed the work to make Egypt the superpower of the day, not just militarily, but economically and socially. They were the big daddy rabbit for everything, okay? So all this guy had to do, the guy that follows this fella, all he has to do is kind of sit back and collect the tribute from these vassal territories and kind of keep things cooking, right? Because he's on top of the world when he takes over. Interesting thing here, like I say, they tried to erase the history of Thutmose II to the extent that they can. However, for 22 years, Moses was doing some pretty cool stuff. And so they were making statues of him too, apparently. There are those who would tell you they believe this is a statue of Moses rather than Thutmose III, who kind of took over. It says everything that belonged to Moses was simply figuratively transferred to this new Thutmose, and things went along without missing a step. This man is now referred to by scholars as Thutmose III. All of the early statuary attributed to him are actually statues that were made of Moses. And one of the reasons that they say that is if you look at the profile there, they say, look at that nose. So that's a Jewish nose if anybody ever saw one, right? So that's one of their reasons. So what happens? Well, Tutmosis III dies without a son, but they know this is not a surprise because he reigns for 32 years. He has no son. Hatshepsut is still in charge as co-regent, right? Pharaoh part of the time. She recognizes this problem. So she says, we got to get somebody else in this training pipeline. You know, if you, great royal wife, are not going to have a son, we need to find one. Okay? So they did the same thing. They took another person from probably a son from another secondary wife and plugged him into this position so he could start training. And he actually trained in that position for like 29 years. Okay? So, but Hatshepsut is still in charge, along with this guy she just raised, Amenhotep II, and she puts this other guy in there to start training. So essentially, there are 3 co-regents in charge at the time. Okay? The senior and most powerful among them is Hatshepsut, right? So, speaking of this guy, they just got stuck in the position. He inherited the throne at a time when Egypt was well established as the world ruler. All he basically had to do was sit back and collect the foreign tribute as it arrived. Egypt had military troops stationed in all of the vassal territories and maintained their empire peaceably. In his inscriptions, this emperor makes claims to be a triumphant warrior, but these references are to the time of his co-regency when he was accompanied by Amenhotep II in his triumphant exploits. And of course, he got credit for Moses' exploits as well. But most interesting about this man is the fact that historical data shows he actually had no claim to the throne. He was not the firstborn of the Pharaoh. And this is kind of a big deal, but it sort of has to be overlooked because he didn't have a firstborn of a Pharaoh, right? So, this is the standard mode of becoming emperor. The well-known Sphinx stela, still present between the paws of the Sphinx at Giza, tells the strange story of how Tutmosis IV fell asleep. One day in the shadow of the Sphinx, he dreamed that the sun god came to him and told him that if he were to clear away the sand from around the Sphinx, he would make him king. This elaborate story would not have been needed if he had been entitled to the throne as rightful heir. Okay, so I won't read all this to you, but this is the story of Tutmosis IV this is the inscription on the stela, that's that stone in between the paws of the great Sphinx, tells this story. The guy goes and sits down, he falls asleep. The sun god comes to him and says, hey, look, you know, my paws are all covered up with sand and stuff, so if you'll clear the sand away, I'll make you king. Okay, so that was his legitimizing to become the king. So this is the way this looked. Now, this guy happened to actually have a son. He was married to a no-kidding Pharaoh's daughter. And this son was a guy by the name of Tutankhamun, whom we all know, right? Now, so he winds up getting shoved in this position. Remember, this is 32 years after Moses left. So he reigns for 8 years before Moses returns, all right? Hatshepsut dies about 6 years after this. So about 2 years before Moses returns, his stepmother dies. So she does not have to see the plagues of Egypt or the ruination of Egypt, all right? But this guy now, except for the fact that Amenhotep III is not the firstborn of a pharaoh, he's got a more legitimate royal bloodline going, and oh, by the way, he has a son, okay? This is a great thing. So they stick him in there, okay? Interesting thing about Tutankhamun. So this mummy mask is perhaps one of the most famous finds in the history of archaeology, but there are no surviving records of Tutankhamun's final days. What caused Tutankhamun's death has been the subject of considerable debate. Major studies have been conducted in an effort to establish the cause of death, and there are lots of theories, but nobody can seem to figure out exactly what caused him to die, okay? Now, a little spoiler, I'm going to suggest to you it was the 10th plague, okay? But we'll get there in a second. So here's what happens. That accession on the third line there didn't actually happen because there wasn't one. So they plugged in this other guy, okay, who happened to have a son. And so immediately, when he gets plugged into this position, Tutankhamun is dubbed the crown prince, and very shortly thereafter, Tutmosis. Now, you'll notice that many people refer to him as King Tut. Tutankhamun never was the pharaoh. However, it's quite possible he was a co-regent. So people could have been referring to him as that kind of a thing, but he never was the actual pharaoh. So, so for a time, there were 3 co-regents ruling and Tutankhamun in the pipeline, right? So this is the pharaoh of the Exodus. This is the guy that Moses said, let my people go to, right? So he was co-regent for 29 years before he took over at year 32 of the other guy's reign. He was not a rightful heir. He was not the firstborn of Pharaoh. Why is that important? If you remember in the 10th plague, the firstborn of everyone, including the Pharaoh, were to die, right? Why didn't the Pharaoh die? The only way you're supposed to become a Pharaoh is to be the firstborn of a Pharaoh. But that Pharaoh didn't die in the plague. He died in the Red Sea, but he didn't die in the plague, right? So he reigned for about 8 years. He appointed his firstborn son, Tutankhamun, as crown prince upon assuming the throne, and he would have become Tutmosis the fifth, but he died around age 18 or 19. So this is a scene from the Ten Commandments, Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, where Yul Brynner is asking his God, why can't you save my son? But the scripture says, and it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on the throne unto the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. But Pharaoh himself did not die. So then it says, it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants were turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Because if you remember, these guys have been slaves in the Egyptian economy now for 100 years, 150 years maybe, something like that. The entire Egyptian economy depended upon this service segment, right? And it wasn't just about making mud bricks, right? They did that. But they were maids, they were cooks, they were gardeners, they raised the food, they tended the flocks, so on and so. They did everything as servants to the Egyptians. The entire economy basically was based upon their labor. So this is a big deal when you lose these guys. And he, the Pharaoh, made ready his chariot and took his people with him. Now, I think I mentioned this earlier, but in those days, when the Egyptian army went to war, the entire priesthood went with them. And much like we read how the Israelites took the Ark of the Covenant with them with the Levites, right? But these guys took the priesthood with all their gods and the priests of the various gods so they could pray to the gods for success in battle. So the priesthood traditionally went, right? But it says it took all his people with him. And it says, verse 7, he took 600 chosen chariots and all the chariots of Egypt, and captains over every one of them. Chosen chariots were typically chariots that were ordained with or decked out with gold, okay? And they belonged to the most senior-most officials in the government, basically the cabinet, right? So if you can imagine, Mr. Trump says we're going to go to war, but he goes out as the leader, and he takes his entire cabinet and all of Congress with him. Is basically what they're doing. And I'm going, that's probably not a bad policy. If we did more of that today, we'd probably have fewer wars, you think? I don't think we'd have to go to war very much. But that's what he did. He took everybody who was somebody in the government with him, including the priesthood. Okay? So, and the Lord rendered the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, hardened his heart, and he pursued after the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with a high hand. But the Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army. This army was renowned in the world at that point. He was the superpower. It was the biggest, baddest, greatest army there was. He said he overtook them encamping by the sea beside Pihahiroth and Baal Zephon, which we'll talk about in future lessons here, Lord willing. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its strength when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians fled against it. And the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh, everybody that was with him, that came into the sea after them. And there remained not so much as one of them, to include the Pharaoh. All right. So this is a bad deal. When you think about it, the plagues have already devastated Egypt, right? And it destroyed all the crops, destroyed the livestock. We got frogs and flies and locusts that are running around. The water of the Nile is blood. They can't drink it. The economy is pretty much dead anyway, but now they lost their workforce. It's deader than dead. And now everybody who is somebody in the government and the priesthood is dead, including the Pharaoh. And oh, by the way, just before he left, the crown prince died. The firstborn son died, okay? So this looks something like this. He thought he had this succession to the throne covered with his firstborn son, Tutankhamun, okay? But he dies. A couple of weeks later, he takes off to chase after the Israelites. He dies. The dynasty is now dead again. It's worse than dead, actually, because there isn't anybody left in the cabinet, in the government, to succeed him. They can't just kind of reach down and pick somebody else up. They're all gone, right? So the only person that's left is the great royal wife, okay? She's the only one of royalty that is actually left. This is not Hatshepsut, but the wife of Amenhotep III, all right? So it's Ron Wyatt talking again. It says, soon after the Red Sea crossing, word arrives at the palace at Memphis that is too fantastic to be believed. The entire Egyptian army, all of the priesthood, all of the senior government officials, and the Pharaoh himself have perished, all drowned in the Red Sea in pursuit of the slaves. The confusion, grief, fear, and agony of the entire country is impossible to imagine. But very quickly, it becomes utmost in the minds of those remaining that knowledge of what has happened must be kept secret. The previous emperor had secured the position of Egypt as the world power. All nations feared and respected Egypt. They all, for the most part, brought their tribute regularly to the palaces, and Egypt had want of absolutely nothing. She had no need to ever go to war, for the nations feared her great army. If word of what happened here became known, Egypt would lose her control over her vassal territories and would mean financial disaster. She's done. So it's what he calls the Egyptian Watergate. So they do not want any of this information to get out. And oh, by the way, it is not recorded in Egyptian history. And oh, by the way, things that might allude to it, such as the existence of a guy named Moses or Tutmosis, right, have been erased, right? They've been changed in the historical record, okay? So she's the only one left. It says there is but one person in Egypt who had the royal right to seat a new pharaoh. This was the original great royal wife of Amenhotep III, the mother of Tutankhamun. But her situation was not an easy one. When her husband took the throne as emperor, he also took a non-royal wife, and she became his favorite. So this is some internal family politics, right? It says the true royal wife and the royal bloodline took the only steps she knew to take to secure strong leadership of the country and provide protection and security for Egypt. She wrote a letter to the Hittite king. We can learn about this in an inscription left behind by his son. So this is pretty wild. But all these other nations were vassal nations to Egypt under their control now. If Egypt was a superpower, the Hittites would have been number 2. Okay? So she writes a letter to the Hittite king. This is an account that's left by the Hittite king's son, who took the throne after him, who wrote an account of his father's reign, right, the kinds of things that he did. Here's what she said. She says, my husband is dead and I have no son. People say that you have many sons. If you send me one of your sons, he will become my husband, for it is repugnant for me to take one of my servants to husband. So, a little forward perhaps, but she's a desperate lady, okay? She needs a husband in order to produce a son to keep the dynasty going, right? So she asked the Hittite king for one of his sons, okay? One of the little hidden things here is that she's basically saying there is no one left in her country who would not be considered a servant. She is not allowed to marry a servant. That is abomination to them, right? So she's reaching out to find somebody else. So the king didn't believe her. So the son of the king says, when my father learned this, he called together the council of the great. Since the most ancient time, such a thing has never happened before. He decided to send Hattushepsut, the chamberlain, and says, go bring me information worthy of belief, that they may try to deceive me. And as to the possibility that they may have a prince, bring me back information worthy of belief. So he sends a chamberlain to the queen to check up on this, right? She writes back. She says, why do you say they're trying to deceive me? If I had a son, should I write to a foreign country in a manner humiliating to me and my country? You do not believe me, and you even say so to me. He who is my husband is dead, and I have no son. Should I then perhaps take one of my servants and make him my husband? I have written to no other country. I have written to you. Okay? Now, at the end of the day, the chamberlain goes back, gives him the report. The king actually sends one of his sons. All right? Unfortunately, the record shows he never showed up. And some records say nobody knows what happens to him. Some others have speculated he was murdered, but he doesn't show up. All right? Leaving the great royal wife in a real pickle, because she's now in a power struggle with the secondary wife. Why? Because she has a son by Amenhotep III. Okay? So she's trying to take control. And at this point, when the Hittite king's son doesn't show, the great royal wife has basically lost the battle. So the secondary wife, in this case, Tai was her name, takes over, right? How does she do that? Well, she marries this guy named I don't know if that's because it rhymes with her name or what, but it turns out he was the man who officiated over the burial of Tutankhamun. So he may not have been one of the cabinet members or something like that, but at least he was somewhere positioned in the hierarchy. And the secondary wife didn't have the same restrictions on her about marrying a servant as the great royal wife would have, right? So she marries this guy, and he becomes sort of a figurehead pharaoh. But at the same time, when they marry, she immediately puts her son, Akhenaten, in as Thutmose, crown prince, and then Thutmose, although he's kind of young at the time as well. So he becomes one of the most famous pharaohs because he completely reorganized the Egyptians' religious order. He moved them from polytheism to monotheism, and he's kind of hailed as, you know, what a visionary guy. And I'm going, well, you might call it visionary, but the entire priesthood, the entire religious order of Egypt has just been destroyed. Okay? So what does he do? He takes control, and he decides that his favorite god, who is Aten, right, is the one that's going to be worshipped throughout the land. So he moved the capital city to Amarna. Later, in Amarna, the entire royal family dies in a plague. Might have been a couple of girls left, but for the most part, they died. So they have this problem again, and they wind up having to plug somebody else in there, but this is kind of the way it looked. Tai takes over, she marries Ai, she puts Akhenaten in there, he becomes pharaoh, he goes to one god. Later on, another guy steps in for Akhenaten because he died as well, and he tries to reestablish a new royal bloodline. Okay, after this, so the whole thing was wiped out. So when the Bible says that God said to Pharaoh, or about Pharaoh, I raised you up for this purpose, this was a big, long process. It was pretty complicated. I don't know about you, but I think I see the hand of God in all of it, right? Because it was bad complicated, but it took a while, and he got it done. So that's what I have for today. Is that hope that makes sense to folks. Yes, sir. That was the training pipeline. Those are the titles that came up. He was, as a baby, he's an heir apparent. As a boy, he's a crown prince. And then as he gets older, teenage, early 20s perhaps, he transitions to this phase they call Thutmose. That's a training phase, essentially. He's training to be Pharaoh. And at some point, when he comes to be trusted enough or trained enough, it's like an apprenticeship kind of a thing. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. You mean the fact that Moses is part of that name? No, it doesn't mean the same thing. Sorry. No. In fact, some of the other spellings are different. Some of them leave off the last S, and they call it Thutmose. Right? So, yeah, that's another confusing thing in the Egyptian thing, is there's 4 or 5 different spellings of some of that stuff. So, yeah. So, yes, sir.
It's quite, there's something that, I know Joseph was not Egyptian.
Right.
He didn't have any linkage with the pharaohs.
Not by bloodline.
Not by bloodline, but his name, didn't come across because he was like, after Pharaoh, he was the prime minister of the country. But as you went through evidence, that his name, never.
Because he's already gone. He's long gone, right? Before any of this, right? Because Joseph became number 2 in the country. He was around 30 years old or so, right?
Right.
But he lived to be 110 years old. And he served probably 3 or 4 different pharaohs. And when he died, he was given a pharaoh's burial. He was given a royal burial. So he was a very important guy in the government there the whole time he was alive. But he's gone long before any of this happens. Remember, the Bible says there arose a pharaoh that knew not Joseph.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay? Anything else? Let's close. Lord Jesus, once again, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it is trustworthy. We know that we can lay our hopes on it, Lord, and we can have trust in it as being true and accurate. Whether the scientific or historical community likes to do that or not, we know we can put our faith in it, Lord. But we pray especially that you would open our hearts and our eyes, that we might know how to understand and to apply it correctly in these last days, that we might serve you well. We ask once again that you'd open our hearts to life as it's broken to us from the pulpit, that we would come away better equipped to serve you. For we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus.